When we think of Hawkins, Indiana, it's easy to picture a sleepy, nostalgic town, a relic of the 1980s frozen in time. But that's a lie. Hawkins isn't a town, it's a scar. A place where the barrier between our world and a dimension of living nightmares was torn open, not by accident, but by design. But before we get sucked into Vecna's mind lair, let us know where you're tuning in from. Hopefully it's somewhere without a secret lab underneath. Alright, to understand the darkness that now bleeds into the streets of this cursed place, we can't start with a missing boy or a girl with a shaved head. We have to go back further, to a time when the monster was still just a boy, and the nightmare was confined to a single, beautiful house on a quiet suburban street. To find the true origin of the rot that would eventually consume Hawkins, you have to rewind the clock to 1959. This was a different America, a post-war boom of idyllic suburbs and picture-perfect families. It was into this dream that the Creel family, Victor, his wife Virginia, and their two children, Alice and Henry, stepped when they moved to Hawkins. Victor was a veteran, a man who had seen the horrors of war and believed he had earned a peaceful life. He used a small inheritance from Virginia's family to buy a home that seemed to promise just that. It was a stately, beautiful house, the kind of place where a family could put down roots and watch their children grow. But some soil is sour. Some houses are born sick. From the moment they moved in, something was wrong. It began subtly, the way these things always do. Flickering lights which could be dismissed as faulty wiring. Dead animals, rabbits, squirrels, owls, appearing on their lawn, their bodies strangely mangled. Victor, ever the pragmatist, tried to find logical explanations. He was a man who believed in order, in cause and effect. But the phenomena escalated, twisting into something deeply personal and psychological. The family began to experience waking nightmares. Virginia would see visions of spiders, a deep-seated phobia brought to life. Victor was haunted by a memory from the war, a horrific mistake where he shelled a civilian home, accidentally killing a baby in its crib. These weren't just bad dreams, they were targeted assaults, as if the house itself was reaching into their minds, finding their deepest fears and regrets and projecting them into reality. The only one who seemed unaffected, even intrigued, was the boy, Henry. Henry was a quiet, solitary child described by his own father as sensitive. He felt out of step with the world, a stranger in his own skin. He found solace not with other children, but with spiders, particularly the Black Widow. He saw a kindred spirit in them, solitary, misunderstood predators. He felt a deep disdain for the rigid, artificial construct of human society. The forced smiles, the tick-tock of the clock, the meaningless routines that structured people's lives. He saw it all as a lie, a fragile order built to mask a chaotic and cruel reality. It was during this time that Henry began to realize he was different in a more profound way. He discovered he had abilities. He could make things happen with his mind. He could see into the past and future, and most terrifyingly, he could manipulate the perceptions of others. The visions tormenting his family weren't just the house, they were him. He was practicing, honing his skills, using his own family as his laboratory. He didn't see it as cruelty, he saw it as a form of truth, forcing them to confront the ugly reality they tried so hard to suppress. His philosophy was simple and nihilistic. Humanity was a plague, a unique type of pest, and he was the predator destined to impose a new, truer order. The family's idyllic life was rapidly unraveling. Virginia became convinced they were cursed, sought the help of the church, and tried to sell the house. But Henry wouldn't allow it. He saw his family as a cage and Hawkins as the lock. He escalated his attacks. One evening during dinner, the final, horrific act began. The radio switched on by itself, playing "Dream a Little Dream of Me," the song that had been a comfort to his mother, now twisted into a sinister soundtrack. Virginia was lifted into the air, her limbs snapping, her eyes gouged out, before she collapsed to the floor, a broken doll. Alice suffered the same gruesome fate. Victor, frozen in horror, tried to get Henry out, but the boy was calm, serene. He revealed his power to his father, confessing to the torment and the murders. Before he could kill Victor, however, the immense psychic effort caused him to slip into a coma. When the police arrived, they found a scene of unbelievable carnage. Victor Creel, holding the front door, was the only one left standing, the prime suspect in a crime no one could possibly comprehend. Henry, the comatose boy, was seen as another victim. This event sent ripples through Hawkins, but the true horror was buried. Victor Creel was institutionalized, branded a monster, his story of a demon in his house dismissed as the ravings of a madman. The real monster, Henry, was taken into the care of a doctor who had heard whispers of the boy's strange abilities. A doctor who saw not a victim, but an opportunity. That doctor's name was Martin Brenner. Henry Creel was pronounced dead to the world, but he was very much alive, and he was on his way to a place that would become the epicenter of Hawkins's nightmare, the Hawkins National Laboratory. The seed of the Upside Down had been planted. The arrival of a comatose Henry Creel at Hawkins National Laboratory marked a pivotal shift in the facility's clandestine operations. Under the direction of Dr. Martin Brenner, a man whose scientific curiosity was unburdened by ethical restraint, HNL was already a key player in the Cold War's most shadowy battleground, the human mind. The lab was the heart of the infamous MKUltra program, a CIA-sanctioned project dedicated to exploring the frontiers of mind control, psychic warfare, and extrasensory perception. Brenner and his team were chasing whispers of Soviet psychic spies, and they were determined to create their own. Their methods were brutal and desperate. They subjected countless unwitting subjects, college students, psychiatric patients, volunteers who didn't know what they were signing up for, to a battery of torturous experiments involving hallucinogenic drugs, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation. One of these test subjects was a young woman named Terry Ives. Drawn in by the promise of contributing to a top-secret government project, Terry endured rounds of experiments, including being submerged in a sensory deprivation tank while under the influence of LSD. What Brenner didn't know, at least not at first, was that Terry was pregnant. The cocktail of psychoactive drugs and the intense psychic pressure of the experiments had an unforeseen effect on her unborn child. The child was born with formidable psychokinetic abilities, a living weapon forged in a crucible of chemicals and fear. Brenner saw his ultimate success. He staged a miscarriage, telling Terry her baby had died, and spirited the infant away to be raised within the sterile, cruel confines of the lab. He named her Jane, but she would only ever be known by the number tattooed on her wrist, 0111. But 11 was not his first success, merely his most powerful. The true catalyst for everything that would follow was the boy he had taken in years earlier, Henry Creel. When Henry awoke from his coma, Brenner was there. He saw in Henry an unprecedented specimen, a natural-born psychic of immense potential. He gave Henry a new identity, a new number, 001. Brenner tried to control 1, to study and replicate his power, but Henry was too strong, too willful, and too intelligent. He resisted Brenner's control, his nihilistic rage simmering just beneath the surface. Realizing he couldn't break him, Brenner chose a different path. He decided to suppress him. He implanted a tiny device in Henry's neck, a chip he called Soteria, which dampened his psychic abilities and induced a form of amnesia. With his powers neutered, Henry Creel, the boy who believed himself a god, was reduced to a mere orderly in the very institution that was now trying to mass-produce children like him. He became a ghost in the machine, a quiet, watchful presence moving through the halls of the lab. This was the first major catalyst, the inciting incident that set the entire tragedy in motion. By taking in Henry, Brenner had brought the fox into the henhouse. By creating 11, he had forged the one weapon that could both stop and unleash him. The lab became a powder keg. On one side, you had a new generation of psychic children, including the immensely powerful 11 being groomed as government weapons. On the other, you had the original number 1, stripped of his power but not his intellect or his hatred, patiently waiting in the wings. He watched the other children, studied them, and paid special attention to the one who reminded him most of himself, the lonely, ostracized 11. He saw her struggles, her isolation, and he recognized a familiar pain. He saw a tool. Brenner, in his hubris, believed he had everything under control. He was the papa, the benevolent father figure to his numbered children, guiding their development, pushing their powers to their absolute limit. He was blind to the fact that his greatest failure and his greatest success were on a collision course, and their impact would tear a hole in the fabric of reality itself. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only define the future of the lab, but would give birth to the very dimension of horror that would later be known as the Upside Down. The clock was ticking down to a massacre. The ecosystem of the Hawkins Lab's Rainbow Room was a strange and brutal microcosm of a school playground, but with telekinesis. Dr. Brenner presided over it all as Papa, a figure of both comfort and terror. To the children he had either created or abducted, he was the sole source of authority and affection. His approval was a reward. His disappointment was a punishment that could manifest as solitary confinement or torturous power-testing exercises. Among this new generation of psychics, 11 was an anomaly. While the others, like the arrogant number 2, could perform impressive feats, levitating objects, manipulating magnetic fields, 11's power was raw, untamed, and deeply connected to her emotional state. It was volcanic, erupting with devastating force when she was afraid or angry, but difficult for her to summon on command. This made her a target. The other children, raised in a competitive and sterile environment, saw her as weak and strange. They bullied her mercilessly, using their own controlled abilities to trip her, humiliate her, and exclude her from their cliques. This constant torment only pushed 11 further into herself, making her feel like the broken, failed experiment they accused her of being. Her only source of comfort came from a surprising place, the quiet, kind-faced orderly who always seemed to be there when she needed him. This was Henry Creel, or Number 1, his identity and powers suppressed by the Soteria chip. To 11, he was simply a friend. He offered her gentle encouragement, told her she was stronger than the others, and gave her advice on how to focus her abilities. He presented himself as a fellow prisoner, a sympathetic ear in a world of cold observation and cruelty. He understood her isolation because he had felt it himself. He planted seeds of rebellion in her mind, subtly framing Brenner not as a father, but as a jailer. He would talk about the outside world, about the idea of freedom, painting a picture of a life beyond the lab's oppressive walls. He was playing a long game, grooming her, earning her absolute trust. He saw in her the key to his own liberation. The rise of 11 as a key figure was not just about her power, but about her relationship with One. He became her mentor, her secret confidant. He taught her how to harness her rage, to draw strength from a memory that made her sad and angry, a technique he had perfected himself. He was, in essence, teaching her to be like him. He guided her through a psychic duel with Number 2, helping her to not just win, but to utterly dominate him, breaking his arm with her mind. This was a turning point for 11. For the first time, she felt the exhilarating rush of control, the intoxicating feeling of her own strength. It was a feeling that both scared and empowered her. One had successfully shown her a glimpse of her true potential, all while positioning himself as her champion. His manipulation was masterful. He convinced her that Brenner was not preparing them for anything great, but was afraid of them. and that he would eventually have her killed, just as he had supposedly killed number 1, a cautionary tale he invented to further sow distrust. He played on her deepest fears and her desperate need for a real connection. The faction that was truly rising within the lab was not 11 herself, but the alliance between the naive, powerful child and the patient, calculating monster hiding in plain sight. Brenner, blinded by his own ego, saw only a powerful asset in 11 and a neutered specimen in his orderly. He missed the quiet conversations, the chess games where one was teaching 11 strategy, the shared glances that spoke of a secret pact. He failed to see that he had created the perfect storm, a girl with the power to open doors between worlds, and a man with the desire to burn both worlds to the ground. The stage was being set for the lab's first and most devastating conflict. The friendly orderly was about to ask for a favor, and in her gratitude and misplaced trust, 11 was about to grant it, unleashing a horror beyond even Brenner's darkest nightmares. The year was 1979. Within the sterile confines of Hawkins' lab, the carefully constructed world Dr. Brenner had built was about to come crashing down. The catalyst was an act of seeming kindness, a manipulation so perfectly executed it would echo through history. Number 1, the friendly orderly, had finally put the last piece of his plan into place. He had earned 11's complete trust. He came to her with a story of escape, a desperate plea. He told her that Brenner and his men were going to kill her, that her recent display of power had made her too dangerous. He claimed he couldn't leave with her because of a tracker implanted in his neck, the very device, soteria, that was suppressing his powers. He was a master liar, weaving a narrative of shared victimhood. He played on her fear, her loyalty, and her burgeoning sense of justice. Believing she was saving her only friend, 11 used her telekinesis to locate the tiny chip in his neck, and with a surge of effort, ripped it from his flesh. It was an act of liberation, but not for her. The moment the soteria chip was removed, the dam broke. The psychic power that Brenner had suppressed for years came rushing back into Henry Creel, and with it, all the memories of who and what he was. The kind, gentle face of the orderly melted away, replaced by a cold, arrogant fury. He unleashed his power in a devastating wave, blasting aside the guards who tried to intervene. He offered 11 a chance to join him, to reshape the world in their image, but she, horrified by the sudden violence, refused. What followed was not a conflict, it was a slaughter. Henry Creel walked through the halls of Hawkins' lab like a vengeful god. He systematically hunted down and murdered every other numbered child, every doctor, every guard who stood in his way. The Rainbow Room became a charnel house, its colorful walls splattered with blood. He twisted bodies, snapped bones, and gouged out eyes, an echo of the same gruesome signature he had used on his own family 2 decades earlier. He was purging the world of what he saw as an inferior copy of himself, a failed experiment. All the while, he broadcasted his nihilistic philosophy into a terrified 11's mind. He explained his past, his hatred for humanity's lies, and his belief that by killing them, he wasn't a monster, but a savior, a predator, imposing natural order. He saw Brenner's experiments as a perversion, an attempt to control and cage something that should be wild and destructive. The immediate aftermath was chaos and carnage. 11, hiding in an observation room, witnessed the full extent of his monstrous power. When he finally found her, he was no longer the friendly orderly. He was number 1, Henry Creel, a self-proclaimed messiah of destruction. He tried one last time to persuade her, to make her understand that they were the same, superior beings meant to rule. But 11 saw the truth. He wasn't a savior, he was a monster, fueled by a memory, not of anger, but of love for her mother, Terry Ives. 11 tapped into a power she never knew she had. It was a pure primal force that went beyond simple telekinesis. Their final duel was a clash of titans, a psychic war that tore the very fabric of the lab apart. Henry was stronger, more experienced, but Eleven's power was raw and absolute. As he was about to deliver the final killing blow, she threw up her hand, unleashing a torrent of energy. It wasn't just a push, it was an unmaking. The sheer force of her psychic blast tore a hole in reality itself, a shimmering, organic wound in the wall of the laboratory. It was the first gate. She didn't just defeat him, she banished him. She held him against the wall as the gate consumed him, his body flayed and burned by the raw, chaotic energy of this new dimension. He was struck by bolts of red lightning, his form twisting and transforming into something hideous as he was cast into the abyss. The effort shattered her, and she collapsed into a coma. The first major conflict was over. Brenner, who had survived the massacre, arrived to find a scene of unimaginable horror. He found 11, his prize asset, unconscious. He knew what had happened. He knew he had lost control. The immediate aftermath was a massive cover-up. The world would never know about the massacre. Brenner would erase the other children from history, focusing all of the lab's resources on the one who had both caused and stopped the catastrophe. 11. And in a dimension of primordial chaos, a dying Henry Creel began a new, horrific evolution, becoming the architect of the nightmare that would one day be known as the Upside Down. The years between the 1979 massacre and the autumn of 1983 represent a lost era for the world, but a critical rebuilding phase for the key players in our story. On the surface, Hawkins, Indiana, was the picture of American normalcy. Kids rode their bikes to the arcade, parents fretted over their children's grades, and the biggest news in town was the annual county fair. Life was predictable, safe, and blissfully unaware of the storm gathering just beneath its feet. Inside the rebuilt and reinforced Hawkins National Laboratory, however, things were drastically different. The massacre had forced Dr. Brenner to change his entire approach. The program was no longer about creating a small army of psychic soldiers. It was now entirely focused on one subject, 11. She was his miracle and his monster, the one who had saved him and the one who had revealed a power far greater than he had ever imagined. The gate she had opened to banish one had closed, but the contact had left an indelible psychic echo. Brenner was now obsessed with the dimension he had glimpsed. He believed it was a place of infinite potential for espionage, a perfect listening post to spy on the Soviets. The experiments on 11 became more intense, more focused. He forced her back into the sensory deprivation tank again and again, pushing her to reach out with her mind, to find that dark, empty place she had touched before. He wanted her to be a psychic spy, to eavesdrop on Russian generals. He was completely unaware that he was forcing her to knock on the door of the very monster she had created. While 11 was being honed into a tool in a secret war, the four boys who would become the heart of the resistance were forging their own alliance in a basement. Mike Wheeler, the passionate leader, Dustin Henderson, the pragmatic intellectual, Lucas Sinclair, the skeptical realist, and Will Byers, the gentle soul of the group. Their world was defined by Dungeons and Dragons, a game of fantasy and camaraderie that, unbeknownst to them, was teaching them everything they would need to know about fighting real monsters. Their bond, forged over marathon gaming sessions and shared secrets, was becoming an unbreakable shield of friendship. This was their own rebuilding phase. Elsewhere in Hawkins, the other pieces were moving into place. Joyce Byers, Will's mother, was a fiercely protective and often underestimated single mom, working hard to provide for her two sons, Jonathan and Will. Her older son, Jonathan, was a quiet, artistic loner, finding solace in photography and punk rock, feeling like an outsider in his own town. Police Chief Jim Hopper was a man hollowed out by grief. The death of his daughter Sarah from cancer years earlier had destroyed his marriage and left him a shell of the man he once was. He sought refuge in apathy, alcohol and pills, policing a town where nothing ever happened, a quiet purgatory to wait out the rest of his days. And in the halls of Hawkins High, a different kind of social hierarchy was in place. Steve Harrington was the king, the popular jock with great hair and a casual arrogance. He was dating Nancy Wheeler, Mike's older sister, a smart and diligent girl who was just beginning to explore a world beyond textbooks and good grades. Their lives, and the lives of everyone in Hawkins, were running on parallel tracks, completely ignorant of the fact that they were all about to be violently derailed. This lost era was the calm before the storm. It was a time of quiet growth and hidden pain. Friendships deepened, grief festered, and ambitions brewed. It was a period of fragile peace, the last breath of normalcy before the first real crack appeared in the wall of their reality. Brenner's relentless pushing, his obsession with using 11 to spy on the enemy, would soon lead him to make a catastrophic miscalculation. He was about to command her to make contact with something far more terrifying than a Russian general, and in doing so he would reopen the very wound she had created years before. The rebuilding was over. The emergence was about to begin. The date was November 6, 1983. In the lowest levels of Hawkins National Laboratory, a new experiment was underway, one that would irrevocably shatter the fragile peace of the town above. Dr. Brenner, driven by the pressures of the Cold War and his own insatiable curiosity, was pushing 11 to her absolute limits. He no longer cared about simple telekinesis or flipping vans. He wanted her to be his ultimate spy, to project her consciousness across the globe and listen in on the secrets of his enemies. Dressed in a crude diving suit and submerged in the sensory deprivation tank, 11 was sent on a mission to eavesdrop on a Russian agent. She was a ghost, a psychic projection moving through a void of infinite black. But as she listened to the Russians speak, she heard something else. A sound, a guttural, animalistic chittering that didn't belong. It was a creature, and it was close. Brenner, hearing her report this through the intercom, became intrigued. This was not the target, but it was something new, something unknown. Instead of pulling her out, he made a fateful decision. He ordered her to make contact. He wanted to know what it was. Terrified, 11 obeyed. She reached out with her mind, moving through the black void toward the source of the sound. What she found was a creature unlike anything she had ever conceived. It was tall and gaunt, with long, spindly limbs and a head that peeled open like a horrifying flower, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. It was hunched over a strange, pulsating egg, seemingly feeding from it. It was the first time a human consciousness had ever encountered a demogorgon. The creature, existing in its own dimension, sensed her presence. It turned its eyeless head toward her psychic projection, its interest piqued. In that moment of pure terror, 11 screamed. Her psychic scream, amplified by the machinery of the lab, didn't just break the connection, it tore through the dimensional barrier. Back in the lab's control room, a deep, guttural roar echoed from the experiment chamber. The concrete wall behind the tank began to crack, a black, viscous substance oozing out. It pulsed and stretched like living tissue before ripping open into a raw, bleeding wound in reality. It was the Mother Gate, a direct portal to the dimension the Demogorgon called home. The creature, drawn by the psychic energy, stepped through. That same night, a few miles away, Mike, Dustin, Lucas, and Will were finishing a 10-hour Dungeons & Dragons campaign. In their game, they had just faced a monster of the same name, the Demogorgon. As Will Byers biked home, taking a familiar shortcut past the woods that bordered the Department of Energy lands, he had no idea that the fantasy of his game had just become a terrifying reality. The Demogorgon, having escaped the lab and killed a scientist, was now hunting in the woods. It saw Will. The lights on his bike flickered and died as the creature's presence warped the electromagnetic field around it. A chase ensued. Will, terrified, crashed his bike and fled on foot to his home, grabbing a shotgun to defend himself. But this was a monster that didn't obey the laws of physics. As Will stood in the shed behind his house, aiming the gun at the door, the light bulb above him glowed impossibly bright, and then burst. The creature was no longer outside. It was right there with him, and then he was gone. Will Byers had vanished into thin air. This was the true re-emergence of the threat. It wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a physical entity, a predator, loose in Hawkins. The gate that 11 had opened in 1979 to banish one had been a violent, temporary tear. This new gate, the Mother Gate, was a stable, weeping wound, and through it, the horrors of another world had their first taste of ours. The disappearance of Will Byers was not a simple case of a lost child. It was the first shot fired in a war that Hawkins didn't even know it was fighting. The nightmare was no longer contained within the walls of the lab. It was out. The disappearance of Will Byers sent a shockwave through the small town of Hawkins, but it was a wave that registered differently for everyone. For most, it was a tragedy, a sad but ultimately explainable event. A kid got lost, or worse, was taken by a human predator. But for a select few, the event signaled the beginning of something deeply, fundamentally wrong. A new order of understanding was beginning to form, splintering the town into those who saw the mundane and those who were being forced to see the supernatural. This created immediate and intense internal conflicts. At the center of the storm was Joyce Byers. Her mother's intuition told her this was no ordinary disappearance. The first sign came as a phone call. The line was filled with static, but beneath it she could hear a faint, distorted breathing. She was certain it was Will. Then a powerful electrical surge blew out the phone, leaving her shaken and terrified. When she tried to explain this to the authorities, including Police Chief Hopper, she was met with pitying skepticism. To them, she was a frantic mother, overwrought with grief and clinging to impossible hope. The town began to whisper that she was having a breakdown, pushing her further into isolation. While Joyce was being dismissed as hysterical, another group was forming their own investigation. Mike, Lucas, and Dustin refused to believe Will was gone. Armed with binoculars, compasses, and snacks, they set out into the woods where Will's bike was found, determined to find their friend. It was during this search in the pouring rain that they stumbled not upon Will, but upon a girl. She was shivering, wearing only a hospital gown, and her head was shaved. She couldn't or wouldn't say much, but they saw the number tattooed on her wrist, Wellman. This was their first encounter with 11, who had just escaped the lab in the chaos following the Demogorgon's arrival. The boys, led by Mike, made the fateful decision to hide her in his basement. This act created a major internal conflict within their own party. Mike, driven by compassion, felt an immediate need to protect this strange, scared girl. Lucas, ever the pragmatist, saw her as a dangerous liability, a weirdo who would get them into serious trouble. Dustin found himself caught in the middle, intrigued by the mystery, but wary of the risks. They were now harboring a fugitive from a secret government lab, a fact that put them in direct opposition to the dangerous bad men who were searching for her. Meanwhile, Chief Hopper's investigation was slowly peeling back the layers of the official story. Initially, he treated it like any other case, but strange inconsistencies began to pile up. He found it odd that the Department of Energy was so heavily involved in a missing child case. He discovered that the state trooper who found Will's bike was not allowed to get too close to the lab. His instincts, long dulled by apathy, began to sharpen. He was starting to suspect that the people at the lab weren't telling him the whole truth, creating a conflict between his duty as a local cop and the stonewalling of a powerful federal entity. This new order was defined by these fractured groups, all seeking the same boy but operating on completely different sets of information. Joyce was on a lonely, terrifying path, trying to communicate with her son through flickering lights and walls that seemed to breathe. The boys were hiding a psychic girl who seemed to know things about Will, but couldn't explain how. And Hopper was a lone wolf, sniffing around the edges of a conspiracy he couldn't yet comprehend. The conflict was everywhere. Joyce versus the town's perception of her sanity. The boys' friendship tested by the secret of 11. Hopper versus the bureaucratic wall of the lab. Everyone was working in the dark, and their separate investigations were about to collide in a way that would force them to accept a truth far stranger than any of them could have imagined. The mundane world was cracking, and through those cracks a new, terrifying reality was beginning to seep in. The various threads of investigation and belief in Hawkins, all frayed and separate, were about to be violently woven together by a series of critical turning points. These were the moments where skepticism shattered against the hard edge of impossible proof, forcing the key players to accept that they were not dealing with a normal crisis. The paradigm of reality in Hawkins was about to shift permanently. For Joyce Byers, the turning point came in a blaze of light. She had already experienced the phone calls and a terrifying glimpse of a creature clawing its way through her living room wall. But her communication with Will became undeniable when she bought every string of Christmas lights she could find. She hung them all over her house, assigning letters to each light. In a scene of frantic, desperate hope, she called out to her son, and the lights began to blink in response. WILLRIGHTHERE. Then, more urgently, RUN. It was no longer a mother's delusion, it was a conversation. She had found a way to speak with her son across dimensions. She now had irrefutable proof that he was alive, somewhere close, and in terrible danger. For the boys, the turning point was less about lights and more about magnetism. 11, trying to explain Will's predicament, flipped over their Dungeons & Dragons board. The clean top side was their world, Hawkins. The dark, empty underside was where Will was trapped. She called it the Upside Down. To demonstrate its proximity, she showed them how her presence and the presence of the gate at the lab was disrupting the Earth's magnetic field. Their compasses no longer pointed north, they pointed directly toward Hawkins' lab. This was scientific, tangible evidence that Lucas, the skeptic, couldn't deny. Their fantasy game had provided the perfect metaphor for a terrifying new reality, and a simple compass had become their guide to the heart of the mystery. This led them directly toward the lab, and directly into the path of the bad men. The most pivotal event, however, was the one that united all the disparate groups. The state police announced they had found Will's body in the water of the local quarry. For a moment, it seemed like the end. The town grieved, and even the boys' resolve wavered. But 11, seeing Mike's devastation, used her powers to hijack his walkie-talkie and broadcast the sound of Will quietly singing his favorite song, Should I Stay or Should I Go? It was proof he was still alive, somewhere. The body was a fake. This single act of psychic intervention was the spark that ignited Chief Hopper's simmering suspicion into a full-blown inferno. He had been troubled by the neatness of it all, the way the state police had handled the discovery. He went to the morgue, punched out the guard, and demanded to see the body. He took a knife and sliced open the torso, only to find it stuffed with cotton wadding. It was a dummy, a prop in a massive, elaborate lie. This was the point of no return for Hopper. He was no longer just a cop investigating a missing kid. He was a man who had stared a vast government conspiracy in the face and knew it was real. From this moment on, the separate factions began to merge. Hopper, armed with the knowledge of the fake body, sought out Joyce, finally believing her story about the lights. They formed an alliance determined to uncover the truth at the lab. Nancy Wheeler and Jonathan Byers, on their own quest to find the monster that took Nancy's friend Barb, also had their own turning point, developing a photograph that showed a clear image of the Demogorgon. These events were the final nails in the coffin of normalcy. A grieving mother, a disillusioned police chief, and a group of nerdy kids were now all on the same page, united against a common, unseen enemy. The question was no longer, what happened to Will? It had become, how do we get him back from the upside down? While the central mystery of Will Byers' disappearance drove the main plot forward, a parallel tragedy was unfolding that would fundamentally alter one of the story's key figures. This was the fall of Barbara Holland and the subsequent transformation of Nancy Wheeler. Before the chaos, Nancy was the embodiment of the perfect, high-achieving older sister. She was smart, responsible, and her world was neatly defined by good grades, a handsome boyfriend in Steve Harrington, and the desire to fit into the popular crowd. Her best friend, Barb, was her anchor to her more studious, less conventional self. Barb was cautious, sensible, and deeply loyal, acting as Nancy's conscience. The catalyst for Nancy's transformation was a party at Steve Harrington's house. Pressured by Steve and her own desire to be seen as cool, Nancy convinced a reluctant Barb to come along. It was a classic high school scene: teenagers, beer, and burgeoning romance. Nancy, swept up in the moment, abandoned Barb by the poolside to go upstairs with Steve. This single, seemingly small act of teenage selfishness would have catastrophic consequences. While Nancy was losing her virginity, Barb sat alone by the pool, her hand bleeding from a failed attempt to shotgun a beer. The scent of her blood attracted the predator that was now stalking Hawkins. The Demogorgon emerged from the woods, dragged a terrified Barb into the pool, and pulled her into the upside down. Her disappearance was swift, silent, and unnoticed by anyone at the party. In the days that followed, Nancy was consumed by a gnawing guilt. She lied to Barb's parents, claiming Barb had gone home. She tried to convince herself of the same, but deep down, she knew something terrible had happened. The fall wasn't just Barb's, it was Nancy's fall from innocence. The carefully constructed world she had built for herself, a world of popularity and teenage romance, now felt hollow and meaningless. Her guilt became the fuel for a new, powerful resolve. She couldn't be the perfect daughter or the popular girlfriend anymore. She had to be an investigator. She had to find Barb. This quest pushed her away from Steve, whose primary concern was not getting in trouble with his parents, and pulled her toward an unlikely ally, Jonathan Byers. Jonathan, also searching for his brother Will, had been in the woods near Steve's house that night, taking pictures. One of the photos he developed captured a fleeting glimpse of Barb by the pool just moments before she vanished, and in the corner of that same photo, a shadowy, indistinct figure lurked. Nancy's transformation was cemented when she and Jonathan decided to hunt this figure themselves. They bought weapons, a baseball bat with nails, a bear trap, and a revolver, and prepared to face the unknown. This was a new Nancy Wheeler. The girl who once worried about what to wear to a party was now practicing her swing with a makeshift mace. She had shed her old identity, forged in the fires of guilt and grief. The discovery of Barb's ultimate fate was the final devastating blow. When Nancy and Jonathan managed to create a small portal, and Jonathan briefly entered the Upside Down, he didn't find Will, but he saw the horrifying truth: Barb's decaying corpse, a slug-like creature crawling out of her mouth. The hope of finding her alive was gone, replaced by the grim certainty of her death. This knowledge didn't break Nancy, it hardened her. It transformed her mission from one of rescue to one of vengeance. The death of Barb was more than just a side plot. It was the story's first clear demonstration of the real, permanent cost of the Upside Down's intrusion. It proved that not everyone gets saved, and it created a warrior. Nancy Wheeler, driven by the ghost of her forgotten friend, would go on to become one of the most capable and relentless fighters against the forces of the Upside Down, her transformation a stark reminder of the price of survival. As the heroes of Hawkins began to grasp the nature of the immediate threat, a lone predator they called the Demogorgon, they remained blissfully unaware of the true power structure of the dimension it came from. They believed they were fighting a single monster, but they were only fighting a foot soldier. The introduction of the true antagonist of this saga was subtle, a terrifying revelation reserved for those who had managed to cross the dimensional threshold: Joyce Byers and Chief Hopper. After piecing together the truth about the lab and the Upside Down, Joyce and Hopper made a deal with Dr. Brenner. They would lead him to 11, who had gone into hiding, in exchange for access to the gate to rescue Will. Donning hazmat suits, they stepped through the mother gate at Hawkins' lab and into a world of living nightmare. The Upside Down was a dark, twisted mirror of Hawkins. It was a place of perpetual twilight, choked by floating, spore-like particles and draped in slimy, pulsating vines. The air was toxic, the silence punctuated by the distant roars of unseen things. It was here, while searching for Will, that they began to understand the scale of the horror. This wasn't just an empty wilderness, it was a connected, living system. The vines that covered every surface seemed to pulse with a single, malevolent intelligence. When Hopper cut one with his knife, they all recoiled, and a distant creature shrieked in pain. It was a hive mind. They found Will in the Upside Down's version of the Castle Byers fort, weak and barely conscious. But he wasn't alone. A long, organic tendril was snaked down his throat, seemingly feeding on him, or perhaps infesting him. They managed to pull it out and resuscitate him, but the damage was done. He had been connected to the hive for too long. The true nature of the Dimension's master was only revealed to Will himself. During his time trapped in the Upside Down, he had seen it, a colossal entity, vast and spider-like, made of shadow and lightning, that blotted out the sky. It was a creature of immense power and intelligence, the alpha predator of this dark ecosystem. The Demogorgon wasn't its equal, it was its hound, a scout sent to hunt and retrieve. This was the shadow monster, the entity the kids would later name the Mind Flayer. The introduction of the Mind Flayer fundamentally changed the stakes. The fight was no longer about a single creature that had slipped through a crack. It was about an invading consciousness, a viral entity that didn't just want to kill, it wanted to conquer, to spread, and to assimilate. Its goal was to terraform our world into a new colony for its own dimension, using the bodies of its inhabitants as hosts. It was a sentient plague. When Will was rescued and returned to Hawkins, he brought a piece of the Upside Down back with him. In the final moments of his ordeal, just before Joyce and Hopper arrived, the Mind Flayer had personally infected him, filling his body with its shadowy essence. Weeks later, after the Demogorgon was defeated and the gate seemingly sealed by 11, Will stood in front of his bathroom mirror. He coughed up a black, slug-like creature into the sink, a baby Demogorgon, and for a split second his vision flickered, showing him the Upside Down with the colossal shadow monster looming over a storm-racked Hawkins Middle School. The new antagonist had been introduced. It wasn't just a monster, it was a god of its own dark world, and it now had a spy, a foothold, in ours. The victory the heroes celebrated was hollow. They had closed a door, but the true enemy had already slipped a key under it. The fight for Hawkins was just beginning. A year had passed since the events of November 1983. On the surface, Hawkins had settled back into a semblance of normalcy. The official story was that Will Byers had gotten lost in the woods, and the strange events at the lab were attributed to a chemical spill. But beneath this fragile veneer, the trauma lingered, and a new, far more insidious conflict was brewing. The stakes were about to become terrifyingly broader. The second major conflict began not with a bang, But with a flicker, Will Byers, the boy who came back, was not okay. He was plagued by episodes, sudden flashes where he was transported back to the Upside Down. He called them now memories. In these visions he saw the colossal shadow monster, the Mind Flayer, looming ever larger over Hawkins, its storm-like tendrils reaching down toward the town. At first, these were dismissed by a well-meaning but misguided doctor at the lab as anniversarial PTSD, but they were not memories, they were a live feed. The Mind Flayer was using its connection to Will to see into our world, and in turn, Will was seeing it. The invasion had begun, and it was silent and subterranean. Strange phenomena started to appear across Hawkins. Pumpkin patches owned by local farmers were suddenly blighted, rotting from the inside out, with a strange, slimy growth. Chief Hopper, investigating the complaints, discovered that the rot was spreading in a specific pattern, emanating from a central point, Hawkins' National Laboratory. He began to dig, literally, and uncovered a vast, sprawling network of tunnels snaking beneath the town, coated in the same organic, living tissue as the Upside Down. The Mind Flayer wasn't just spying, it was terraforming. It was actively spreading the biology of its world into ours, creating a superhighway for its creatures right under everyone's feet. Simultaneously, new players arrived in town, adding to the instability. Max Mayfield, a tough, cynical arcade master, and her older stepbrother Billy Hargrove, a charismatic but violent and abusive teenager, roared into Hawkins. Max quickly caught the attention of both Dustin and Lucas, creating a rift in the party's dynamic. Billy, with his aggressive alpha male energy, became an immediate antagonist to Steve Harrington, challenging his social standing and bringing a volatile, unpredictable human threat into the mix. The central conflict shifted from rescue to infestation. The Mind Flayer, tired of just watching, decided to take a more active role. During one of Will's episodes on the school field, it confronted him. Instead of running, Will, following the bad advice of his doctor to face his fears, stood his ground. This was a fatal mistake. The Mind Flayer seized the opportunity, surging forward and invading Will's body completely, its shadowy tendrils pouring down his throat and into every cell. Will Byers was no longer just a spy. He was a puppet. The Mind Flayer now had a host, a vessel it could control. It could see what he saw, hear what he heard, and feel what he felt. The stakes had been raised exponentially. It was no longer about keeping a monster out. The monster was now inside one of their own. The group was fighting a war on two fronts. On one, they had to contend with the physical spread of the Upside Down through the tunnels and the emergence of a new pack of creatures, smaller, faster demogorgons they dubbed demodogs. On the other, they faced a far more terrifying psychological battle. Their friend, Will, was now the enemy's main weapon. Anything they learned, the Mind Flayer learned. Any plan they made, the Mind Flayer knew. It could use Will's memories, his love for his friends and family, against them. The broader conflict was clear. This was a full-scale invasion, and the Mind Flayer's ultimate goal was to merge the two worlds, extinguishing all life and warmth, and remaking Hawkins into a cold, dark extension of its own dimension. In the escalating war against the Mind Flayer's invasion, the heroes found themselves cornered, outmaneuvered, and facing an enemy that knew their every move. Their desperate struggle culminated in a siege at the one place that should have been a sanctuary of science and reason, Hawkins' National Laboratory. And it was here that one of the story's most beloved figures would make the ultimate sacrifice. The group, including Joyce, Hopper, Mike, a possessed Will, and the lab's original scientist, Dr. Sam Owens, were trapped inside HNL. The power was out, the emergency systems had failed, and the building was swarming with a pack of ravenous demodogs drawn to the lab by the Mind Flayer's will. Their only hope of escape was to manually override the security system and unlock the doors, a task that required navigating a treacherous maze of basement corridors. The man who stepped up was Bob Newby. Bob was Joyce's new boyfriend, a kind, good-natured manager of the local Radio Shack. He was a nerd in the purest sense, brilliant with computers, endlessly enthusiastic about puzzles and technology, and a fundamentally decent man who had brought a sense of stability and happiness back into the buyers' lives. He was in every way a hero hiding in plain sight. With the demodog scratching at the doors and time running out, Bob volunteered for the suicide mission. He was the only one who understood the lab's antiquated basic programming language. Armed with a map and a radio, he set off alone into the dark basement. The tension was almost unbearable as he guided the group through the lockdown sequence, rebooting breakers and typing commands while the creatures closed in around him. He was their lifeline, a calm voice of reason in a storm of chaos. Against all odds, he succeeded. The lights flickered back on and the locks on the doors throughout the facility clicked open. He had done it. He had saved them. His journey back to the lobby was a heart-pounding sprint. He narrowly evaded a pouncing demodog, his triumph visible on his face as he saw Joyce and the others waiting for him just a few feet from the exit. For a fleeting, beautiful moment, it seemed like he was going to make it. The audience, along with the characters, let out a collective sigh of relief.
He had won. And then, in a brutal, gut-wrenching instant, the hope was extinguished. A demodog, faster than the others, burst through a side door and tackled him to the ground. The others could only watch in horror as a pack of the creatures descended on him, tearing him apart just yards from safety. Joyce's screams echoed through the lobby as Hopper dragged her away, forcing her to leave the man she loved behind to be devoured. Bob Newby's death was a devastating loss.
It was not the noble death of a soldier, but the brutal, meaningless slaughter of a good man. His sacrifice was not a strategic choice. It was a necessity born of desperation, and it served as a horrific reminder of the real, tangible cost of this war. He wasn't a warrior or a psychic. He was just a man who loved a woman and her children enough to lay down his life for them. His death bought the others the precious seconds they needed to escape, but it left a deep, unfillable hole in their lives, particularly for Joyce. It was a stark lesson that in this fight, being smart and being brave wasn't always enough. Sometimes the monsters just win. The sacrifice of Bob the Brain was a profound moment of heartbreak that galvanized the group, hardening their resolve to end the nightmare once and for all. The brutal death of Bob Newby and the full possession of Will Byers sent a wave of psychological and emotional fallout through the scattered group of heroes, forcing them to confront the deep trauma of their ongoing war. The battle was no longer just against external monsters. It was now an internal struggle against grief, fear, and the horrifying reality that their friend was the vessel for their enemy. The most intense fallout centered on the Byers family and their desperate attempt to save Will. They retreated to their small, isolated cabin in the woods, a place the Mind Flayer didn't know about. Their plan was born of a terrible realization. The Mind Flayer, like a virus, thrived in the cold and dark of its own dimension and hated heat. To save Will, they would have to burn the virus out of him. What followed was essentially a torturous homespun exorcism. They tied Will to his bed in a shed, heated to an unbearable temperature with space heaters. As his body temperature rose, the shadow entity within him began to fight back, thrashing and screaming in a voice that was not Will's. It was a harrowing ordeal for Joyce, Jonathan, and Mike, who had to inflict immense pain on someone they loved, watching as the boy they knew seemed to be erased by the monster inside. Joyce, fresh from the trauma of watching Bob die, now had to face the potential death of her own son, holding his hand and speaking to him, trying to reach the real Will, buried under layers of shadow and rage. They used their shared history as a weapon, recounting memories and playing his favorite music. fighting a psychological war for his soul while waging a physical one against the entity possessing him. Parallel to this agonizing exorcism was Eleven's own journey of psychological discovery. After a heated argument with Hopper, who had been hiding her in the cabin for her own safety, she discovered a box of his old files. Inside, she found information about her mother, Terry Ives. Driven by a need to understand her past and find a real home, she ran away. Her journey first led her to the catatonic Terry, where a psychic connection revealed the truth. Brenner had stolen her at birth, but it also revealed something else. She wasn't alone. There was another girl like her from the lab, Kaylee, number 8. 11 tracked Kaylee to a hideout in Chicago, finding not a sister, but the leader of a gang of punk rock outcasts. Carly's power was different. She could project illusions into people's minds, making them see things that weren't there. She too was a victim of Brenner, but her response to her trauma was not to hide, but to seek revenge. She and her gang hunted down and killed the former HNL employees who had wronged them. For a brief time, 11 was seduced by this life. Carly taught her to channel her anger, to use the pain of her past to make her powers stronger. She gave 11 a punk makeover and brought her on a mission to kill one of their targets. But when the moment came and 11 had the man at her mercy, she saw he had children. She couldn't do it. She was not a killer. This was her critical moment of emotional fallout and self-realization. She understood that revenge was an empty path that would consume her, just as the Mind Flayer was consuming Will. In a psychic vision, she saw her friends at Hawkins' lab in mortal danger. She knew then where she belonged. The emotional fallout for both 11 and the Byers family forced them to define who they were. Joyce, Jonathan, and Mike affirmed their unwavering love for Will, willing to go to hell and back to save him. 11, confronted with a dark reflection of what she could become, chose love and friendship over anger and vengeance. She chose to be a protector, not an assassin. This psychological crucible forged them into the weapons they needed to be for the final confrontation. Will was successfully freed from the Mind Flayer's control, and 11, her powers now magnified by a clear purpose, was heading back to Hawkins to close the gate for good. With Will Byers finally free from the Mind Flayer's control, the group had a crucial temporary advantage. For the first time in months, they could make a plan that the enemy couldn't overhear. The endgame was clear: the Mother Gate, the massive wound in reality festering beneath Hawkins' lab, had to be closed. But the situation was perilously complex. The Mind Flayer, though temporarily blinded, was still in control of its vast network of tunnels and its army of demodogs, and it would do anything to protect the gate, its main artery into their world. The final push required a coordinated, multi-pronged strategy, a desperate gambit that would split their forces and send them all towards seemingly impossible tasks. The first and most critical part of the plan fell to Chief Hopper and 11. They were the only two who could get to the gate and seal it. 11 had the raw power to close the wound, and Hopper had the grit and firepower to get her there. Their mission was a direct descent into the heart of the hive, a journey into the literal underworld beneath the lab to face the source of the invasion. This was a mission from which they might not return, and the weight of the world rested on a grieving cop and a teenage girl who had only just begun to understand the scope of her abilities. The second part of the plan was a diversion. They knew that as soon as 11 began her psychic assault on the gate, the Mind Flayer would send every demodog it had to stop her. To prevent this, another team had to draw the hive mind's attention elsewhere. This task fell to Joyce, Jonathan, and Nancy. Their plan was to use the now liberated Will as bait. They would take him to Hopper's isolated cabin, overheat it again, and essentially ping the Mind Flayer, tricking it into thinking its host was in distress and drawing its attention away from the lab. It was a dangerous psychological feint, requiring them to stay one step ahead of the monster's rage. This left the rest of the party, Steve Harrington, Mike, Dustin, Lucas, and Max, with a third, equally vital objective. They had to get to the hub of the tunnel system, a central point deep beneath the blighted pumpkin patch, and set it ablaze. Their theory was that because the entire system was a hive mind, causing immense pain to a central nexus would distract the Mind Flayer and its army, creating chaos and buying Hopper and 11 the time they needed. Steve, in a remarkable evolution from his King Steve persona, fully embraced his new role as protector and de facto babysitter for the younger kids. Armed with his nail-studded baseball bat, he led the charge into the tunnels, a place they had just barely escaped with their lives. Their preparation was a flurry of activity. They gathered gasoline and supplies, fortified the cabin, and geared up for their respective missions. The mood was grim but resolute. They were no longer just a collection of frightened individuals. They were a cohesive fighting force, each member with a specific role to play. The final push was a testament to how far they had all come. Hopper, the broken man, was now a protective father figure, ready to walk into hell for his adopted daughter. Steve, the arrogant jock, was a courageous leader, willing to sacrifice himself for a group of kids. And 11, the scared and abused child, was now a confident hero, ready to face the source of all her trauma and close the door on the nightmare she had inadvertently helped unleash. They were all heading into the darkness, fully aware that this battle would determine the fate of their town and perhaps their world. The final confrontation of this second major conflict was a symphony of coordinated chaos, fought across 3 different battlegrounds. In the dark, cavernous space beneath Hawkins' lab, Hopper and 11 descended toward the pulsing, raw energy of the Mother Gate. The air crackled with power, and the scale of the wound in reality was immense, a horrifying living portal to a world of death. 11, focusing all her energy, raised her hands and began the arduous process of psychically stitching the gate closed. The Mind Flayer immediately felt the assault. As predicted, it reacted with fury, but its attention was split. High above, in the fiery hub of the underground tunnels, Steve Harrington and the kids were fighting for their lives. Their plan to set the hub on fire had worked, but it had also drawn the attention of a formidable foe, Dart, the demodog that Dustin had raised from a small slug. The creature, now fully grown and lethal, trapped them in the junction. In a moment of unexpected heart, Dustin confronted Dart, not with violence, but with a memory of their brief, strange friendship, offering it a nougat bar. The distraction worked, buying the group the precious seconds they needed to escape the tunnels before they were consumed by the fire they had started. Simultaneously, at Hopper's cabin, the psychological feint was turning into a physical siege. A demodog, not fooled by the diversion, crashed through the window, attacking the group. Just as it was about to pounce on Joyce, a recovered Will, Jonathan, and Nancy, they were saved by the sudden, heroic return of 11. Her appearance was a turning point. She dispatched the creature with a flick of her wrist, her power now more focused and controlled than ever before. But the true climax was not just one battle, but 2, separated by a year of deceptive peace. The first climax was 11's sealing of the gate. Drawing on her deepest emotions, her anger at Brenner, her love for her friends, her grief for her mother, she levitated into the air, blood pouring from her nose, and unleashed a torrent of pure psychic force. The fleshy tendrils of the gate writhed and screamed as she forced the 2 dimensions apart, sealing the portal with a final, thunderous boom. The connection was severed. The Mind Flayer's presence in Hawkins was cut off, and its army of demodogs collapsed, lifeless. Victory was achieved. But it was a temporary victory. A year later, at the Starcourt Mall, the true final confrontation with the Mind Flayer's physical form would take place. The creature, having survived as a severed piece of consciousness, had spent the year using a new proxy, the Russians and their secret machine beneath the mall, to reopen a gateway. It had built a new monstrous body by flaying and melting down the bodies of dozens of Hawkins residents, creating a grotesque multi-limbed behemoth of flesh and bone. The battle at Starcourt was the true culmination. The creature cornered 11, who was now depowered after an injury, along with Mike and Max. Just as it was about to kill them, Billy Hargrove, who had been serving as the Mind Flayer's primary host, broke its control. Fueled by a memory of his mother that 11 had shown him, he sacrificed himself, standing between the monster and the kids, buying them precious time. In the Russian lab deep below, Joyce Byers, with Hopper by her side, faced an impossible choice. The only way to destroy the machine and close the new gate was to turn 2 keys simultaneously. But Hopper was trapped in the room with the machine, unable to escape. With tears in her eyes and a nod from Hopper, she turned her key. The machine exploded, vaporizing the Russians and seemingly Hopper himself. The energy wave destroyed the Mind Flayer's physical body above, finally ending its reign of terror over Hawkins. This double climax, the closing of the Mother Gate and the destruction of the Starcourt beast, represented 2 different kinds of victory. The first was a triumph of supernatural power. The second was a victory of human sacrifice and impossible choices, far more costly and far more final. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Starcourt Mall was deceptively quiet. The colossal, fleshy monster had dissolved into a foul sludge, and the screaming had stopped. But the resolution was anything but triumphant. It was somber, fragmented, and soaked in loss. The US government, led by Dr. Sam Owens, quickly descended on the scene, initiating a massive cover-up. The official story fed to the public was a tragic electrical fire that had consumed the mall. The deaths of Billy Hargrove and the dozens of flayed townspeople were swept under the rug of this official narrative. Hawkins was safe, but the truth was buried once again, leaving the heroes to process their trauma in isolation. The most profound and immediate loss was the apparent death of Jim Hopper. For 11, this was the ultimate devastation. She had lost her father, the one person who had given her a semblance of a normal life, a home. Her grief was compounded by a new and terrifying reality. Her powers were gone. The injury she sustained from the Mind Flayer's bite and the subsequent surgery to remove a piece of the creature from her leg had seemingly severed her connection to her psychic abilities. The girl who could stop monsters with her mind was now, for the first time, just a girl. The Byers family, now a fractured unit, made the difficult decision they had been putting off for a year. They were leaving Hawkins. The town held too many ghosts, too much pain. Joyce, having now lost 2 men she loved to the horrors of the Upside Down, knew they could never be safe there. The resolution became a series of heartbreaking goodbyes. The party, the core group of friends who had faced down monsters together, was being broken apart. The scene of the Byers' moving truck being packed was heavy with the weight of their shared history. Mike and 11's farewell was particularly poignant. They professed their love for each other, a moment of teenage innocence in the midst of world-altering trauma. But their promise to see each other at Thanksgiving felt fragile, uncertain. The most emotionally resonant moment of this aftermath came in the form of a letter. While packing, Joyce found the heartfelt speech Hopper had written for 11 and Mike, a speech he never got the chance to deliver. As 11 read his words, his voiceover filled the silence. It was a letter about change, about growing up, about fear, and about love. It was his final posthumous act of fatherhood, a raw and honest confession of his feelings. It was a gut punch for 11 and for the audience, a final painful twist of the knife confirming his sacrifice. The resolution was a diaspora. The Byers family, with a now powerless and orphaned 11 in their care, drove away from Hawkins, leaving behind a town scarred by a battle no one would ever acknowledge. The heroes had won, but the cost was immense. Their family unit was shattered, its members scattered across the country. The victory felt hollow, a temporary reprieve purchased at an unbearable price. They had closed the gate and destroyed the monster, but they were left broken, grieving, and facing an uncertain future apart from one another. The quiet that settled over Hawkins was not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of exhaustion and sorrow. And far away, in the frozen tundra of Kamchatka, Russia, a secret was being kept. In a bleak, snowy gulag, Russian guards were feeding a prisoner to a captive Demogorgon. When choosing a victim, one guard was told, "No, not the American." Hopper was alive. The resolution was a lie. The victory at Starcourt Mall had been bought with blood, sacrifice, and the fracturing of their found family. For months, the scattered heroes tried to piece together a new sense of normal. But the cost of their previous victories was about to come due, revealing a truth far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. The true cost was the realization that they had never been fighting the real war. They had only been fighting the puppets of a hidden master. The unraveling began with a new string of murders back in Hawkins. But these were different. They were not the animalistic attacks of a Demogorgon or the assimilating horror of the flayed. These were ritualistic, deeply personal and gruesome. A cheerleader, a student journalist, a basketball player, all found dead in their homes, their bodies levitating, their limbs snapped into grotesque angles, and their eyes gouged out. The signature was chillingly familiar, an echo of the Creel family murders from 1959. The kids still in Hawkins, Dustin, Lucas, Steve, Robin, Nancy, and a deeply traumatized Max, realized this was a new threat. Dustin, ever the D&D aficionado, named this unseen killer Vecna, after a powerful undead lich from the game. This was not a mindless beast. This was an intelligent, sadistic entity. The true cost of their past battles became painfully clear through Max. She was drowning in guilt and grief over her stepbrother Billy's death, isolating herself from her friends. This profound trauma made her the perfect target for Vecna. He began to stalk her psychologically, invading her mind with horrifying visions of a grandfather clock and a bleeding, taunting apparition of Billy. This revealed Vecna's method. He targeted teenagers with deep-seated trauma, feeding on their pain before killing them to create a new gate to the Upside Down. The investigation into Vecna led Nancy and Robin to Penhurst Asylum, where they interviewed Victor Creel, the man blamed for his family's murder decades ago. His story of a demon in his house confirmed that this entity had been active long before the events of 1983. The greatest cost, the most shocking revelation, came from the separate journeys of Eleven and the group in Hawkins. Eleven, taken by Dr. Owens to a secret facility to regain her powers, was forced to relive her suppressed memories of the Hawkins lab through a new sensory deprivation tank called Nina. She was forced to confront her past, believing she was the monster who had committed the 1979 massacre. At the same time, the Hawkins group, following clues from Vecna's lair in the Upside Down, discovered the truth. Through a psychic connection, Vecna revealed his full story to Nancy. He was not a demon. He was Henry Creel. He was number one, the friendly orderly. The monster 11 had banished all those years ago. The truth was a cascade of horror. 11 hadn't committed the massacre. She had stopped it. She hadn't opened the first gate out of malice. She had opened it to defeat him. And most importantly, the Mind Flayer, the colossal entity they believed to be the ultimate villain, was not the king of the Upside Down. When Henry Creel was cast into that raw, chaotic dimension, he was transformed, but not defeated. He wandered that primordial hellscape until he found the cloud of shadow particles that would become the Mind Flayer. He saw its power to transcend a single form, and with his own formidable psychic abilities, he shaped it. He gave the swirling chaos a purpose, a form resembling the spiders he had loved as a child. He became the 5-star general of the Upside Down. The Demogorgons, the Demodogs, the Vines, the Hive Mind, even the Mind Flayer itself, they were all his tools, his army. Every battle they had fought, every monster they had killed, had been against a pawn. They had been fighting a war orchestrated by a single, vengeful, human-turned monster, and they never even knew his name. The cost of their victory was the illusion of it. They had never won. They had just been surviving skirmishes while the true enemy consolidated his power and waited for the perfect moment to execute his final plan. The long-term legacy of the events in Hawkins is a stark and terrifying tapestry of failure, resilience, and the horrifying revelation of a master plan decades in the making. Every victory, from the defeat of the first Demogorgon to the destruction of the Star-Caught Beast, was ultimately revealed to be a temporary, Pyrrhic one. The true impact was not the saving of the town, but the slow, inexorable priming of it for a final, catastrophic invasion. Vecna's plan, which had been in motion since he was cast into Dimension X in 1979, was finally revealed in all its horrifying simplicity. He wasn't just killing for sport or revenge. Each of his ritualistic murders targeting a psychologically vulnerable teenager served a specific, terrible purpose. Every time he killed, the psychic energy released from the victim's death tore a new, small gate between the Upside Down and Hawkins. His goal was to create 4 such gates. 4 kills, 4 gates, which when combined, would act like a key, shattering the dimensional barrier on a scale never seen before, and allowing the full, untamed horror of his world to bleed into ours. The legacy of the hero's actions is therefore double-edged. Their fight to save their friends inadvertently put them directly in Vecna's crosshairs. Max's deep trauma from Billy's death made her his 4th and final target. The hero's desperate, elaborate plan to fight Vecna on multiple fronts, in the real world, in the Upside Down, and in Max's mind, was a testament to their growth and courage, but it was ultimately a battle they were destined to lose. In the climax of their confrontation, 11, psychically piggybacking into Max's mind, was temporarily defeated by Vecna. In those crucial moments, he succeeded. He killed Max, her heart stopping for over a minute, and with her death, the 4th gate ripped open. The ground in Hawkins split apart. The 4 gates, energized by the 4 deaths, shot beams of red energy into the sky, converging on the town center and tearing massive, fiery chasms through its streets. The long-term impact was immediate and apocalyptic. Even though 11, in a surge of rage and love, managed to use her powers to restart Max's heart, she was too late. Max was clinically dead long enough for the plan to be completed. The barrier was broken. The legacy of every previous battle was shown to be nothing more than a postponement of this inevitable disaster. The Mind Flayer was a tool. The Demogorgons were hounds. The Russian plot was a convenient secondary front. It had all been orchestrated by Vecna to achieve this one singular goal. This is further cemented by the global scale of the conflict, exemplified by Hopper's journey. His survival in a Russian gulag and his battle against a captive Demogorgon there proved that the Upside Down's influence was not limited to Hawkins. It was a global threat, with different powers trying to weaponize it, all while remaining ignorant of the true consciousness pulling the strings. Hopper's return to Hawkins with Joyce and Murray was a moment of triumphant reunion, but they returned to a town that was actively dying. The long-term legacy is this: Hawkins is no longer just a town with a secret. It is now the beachhead for an interdimensional invasion. The final scene of this chapter of the saga sees the entire reunited party standing on a hill overlooking their home. Snow like ash, the familiar spores of the Upside Down, falls from a blood-red sky, cracked with black lightning. The plant life is dying, turning grey and black as the toxic atmosphere of Vecna's world seeps into theirs. They didn't just lose the battle for Max's soul, they lost the war for Hawkins. Every sacrifice, every loss has only led to this. The legacy is a permanent weeping wound, a world forever changed, and the horrifying knowledge that the enemy they face is more patient, more powerful, and more intimately connected to their own history than they ever knew. The story of Hawkins, Indiana, was never about a town. It was about a wound. A wound inflicted on reality by a broken boy, a wound that was repeatedly and naively patched up with courage and sacrifice, but a wound that was never allowed to heal. Now that wound has burst open and the infection is spreading. The heroes are finally all together, their fractured family reunited after years of struggle across continents and dimensions. Hopper is back, a man who has literally walked through fire and ice. 11 is with him, her powers returned, stronger and more focused than ever. The Byers family has returned to the home that has caused them so much pain. The entire party stands united, a seasoned group of veterans in a war they've been fighting since they were children, but they look out over a town that is no longer theirs. It is a landscape of death, a snapshot of an apocalypse in progress. The sky is a canvas of red lightning, the air is thick with the toxic spores of another world, and the ground itself is cracked and bleeding fire. The upside down is no longer down, it is here. They have won battles, they have saved each other time and time again, but their collective victory has been eclipsed by one monumental loss. Vecna, the architect of all their pain, has succeeded in his master plan. The line between worlds is gone. The thematic conclusion is a brutal inversion of their journey. They started as a small group of friends trying to save one of their own from a monster. They have become a small army standing on the precipice of a global catastrophe, with the monster now holding all the cards. Every fight, every sacrifice has only served to bring them to this final, desperate moment. They are all that stands between our world and the nihilistic vision of a single, powerful being who wants to erase all of it. So the story ends where it truly began, with one final haunting question. The heroes are all together, but Hawkins is a wound bleeding into our world. The question is no longer, can they save their town? It's, is there anything left to save?